We are obviously delighted to bring this event to you, talking about such a relevant topic to a subject matter that affects everybody across the country. But before we get into that, obviously, we want to mention, obviously, that Midland is undergoing a major flood right now, and our prayers are with everyone in the Midland area, including many of my colleagues. I am fortunate enough to be down here in Florida, but I know many of my colleagues are in the process of either losing homes or have homes that have been severely damaged. And our President, Joe Lehman, is going to deliver some opening remarks that will, I'm sure, highlight that. But anyone that is in the Midland area or has family or friends in the Midland area, we are praying for you this morning. It seems like one thing after another this year here in 2020, and it's just another one on top of all of the different crises that our people around the country are going through right now. So I want to actually get to Joe right now for some opening remarks before we introduce our speakers. Joe?
Thank you very much, Don, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in to the show today. And I always like to help kick off the show by giving a short Mackinac Center update. Today's update is really unusual. If you have followed the Mackinac Center for a while, you know that our headquarters is in Midland, Michigan, which is making national news today because of a series of dam failures in some very tightly localized rain events, has sent the contents of 2 lakes rushing to Midland. And so we do have a local crisis. So I say the crisis count today in Midland, Michigan is 3. We have 1 pandemic, we have 1 brutal lockdown, and we have 1 historic flood that is expected to break all records here. And our minds are on some of our colleagues who are actually losing their homes and assessing property damage at the moment. But the Mackinac Center is all about going forward and going onward. That has been such an important part of the spirit of and the success of this country and of the state of Michigan. The United States and Michiganians are known around the world for pushing forward, and it's our particular privilege to be able to push forward the ideas that made the country and the state great. The ideas of freedom and free markets, even in the face of adversity, not even in the face of adversity. It's freedom and free markets that get us through adversity that we face, which is one reason the Mackinac Center calls for very serious scrutiny on the kinds of emergency lockdown orders that have been imposed around the country to deal with the pandemic, because it is only a strong society that is open and able to freely associate and freely trade that can produce the resources we need to overcome a crisis like a pandemic. And so today's program will focus on how different states are doing that differently. And I'm just so grateful for Mackinac Center supporters having been with us through thick and thin, helped us grow into a prominent organization in the network of free market think tanks. The Mackinac Center was the first think tank to sue a governor over governor's emergency powers. We do believe that she has exceeded exceeded her authority, and also done things that are just economically and socially unwise and not good for the community of Michiganians that she is elected to serve. And I was talking to Sandra before the show, and I said, Sandra, my office is a mess for doing the show because we had to get ready for possible floodwaters in the ground floor. And she said, just go with it. Tell them we're in a flood. And so that's why I have boxes behind me and furniture up on desks and things like that. So thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy today's program. And if you're looking for ways to help the people in the mid-Michigan area affected by this flood, any minute now, the Mackinac Center will have a GoFundMe page to assist friends and neighbors who are really getting wiped out by this. Mackinac Center is not keeping any of that money. But if you'd like to help, we'll try to make it easy for you to do so. I just don't know if we've got that page set up yet. So Don, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Joe. And we will make available that page once it is readily available for the general public. Thank you for your really important remarks covering two of these three major crises that we're dealing with right now, and we are praying for you up in Midland, Michigan. So I want to turn back to the program at hand. Today's event is called A Tale of Two States, and we have two really unique elected officials with us, both representing areas that border on other states that are handling the coronavirus response very differently than the states that they reside in. The first that we have is Senator John Lundberg from Bristol, Tennessee, who is actually a Michigan native. He represents a border district on the Tennessee-Virginia line, the home of Bristol Motor Speedway, I believe, in Tennessee. And he's seen firsthand the impact of reopening policies, good and bad, on people that live and work in different states, in fact, just across the street from each other. And we're going to get into that in our event. We're delighted to have Senator Lundberg join us from Tennessee. And we're going to start with our questions with Senator Lundberg, and then I will introduce our next guest. So my first question to you, Senator Lundberg, is your district of Bristol, Tennessee just made national headlines with a story that was covered in CNN, contrasting the reopening policies of Tennessee versus Virginia. And in your district, there is a place where from one street to the other, you're seeing different reopening policies because one side of the street is in Virginia and the other side is in Tennessee. Tell us about that really unique experience in Bristol.
Yeah, and if I can, for everyone to put into perspective, Bristol is probably about the size of Midland. There's about 50,000. And imagine, just for the sake of this, 50-50. And in the center of town, there's a street called State Street, and that is the dividing line. Half is in Virginia, half is in Tennessee. Imagine, if you will, if you want to take Midland in perspective. Midland has now 2 city councils, 2 fire departments, 2 police departments, and 2 state governments that are operating very, very differently. So when you go down State Street, you look one way and you see right now, literally, restaurants that are open. Obviously, we can't fill those to capacity, but a half staff. On the other side, those restaurants are dark. Those small businesses are dark. Hair salons are dark, and those small businesses are going out. And I'll tell you, it's a microcosm of what's happening in many areas, and in the way the states operate and the way the states' policies are really impacting whether it's small businesses or large businesses. It's amazing to see. I'll tell you, I feel for my colleagues on the Virginia side because it is one town, and people can say what they want about that state line. It doesn't necessarily divide us. It actually brings us together. Usually, I'd say there's strengths because there's multiple state senators in this town. There's multiple state representatives in this town. In this case, right now, and in the situation we're at, it really divides us. And the businesses and the homes that are on the Virginia side are really struggling. Whether they'll make it, if they've made it this far, if they'll make it the next 3-4 weeks or past that, I don't know. On the Tennessee side, it's obviously a struggle as well. But at least we've enacted the policies to allow those businesses to resume operation in safe parameters as well.
Yeah, it really is a great story to share. And before we do go on, I want to remind our audience that as questions come to mind that you have for our speakers, you'll see a Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Please feel free to put your questions there. In the final 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation, we will try to get to as many questions as possible. So, Senator, you mentioned how obviously there are folks that live in Tennessee and work in Virginia and vice versa. Any stories you could share about small business owners that are living that story right now?
Well, we cross the state line oftentimes, both politically and business-wise, because it's funny. I talk to my Virginia counterpart, the state senator over there, because oftentimes I'll have a constituent that may work here and live there, or vice versa. They live there and work. So we kind of cross-pollinate that way. But business-wise, I've heard from a number of business owners, frankly, asking what I can do to help them on the Virginia side. And obviously, I have no voice really on that state. It's sad, and aside from truly empathy of what they're going through, that's it. Interestingly enough, we've had a number of businesses that have said, as soon as we can, we're going to move. And we've heard that from a lot of residents as well, who have said, the policies enacted, not just COVID, but you have a much more liberal governor in Virginia that's enacted and pushed through the legislature some things that were, frankly, for our area of the state, whether that's Southwest Virginia or Northeast Tennessee, really isn't keeping in contact with what those folks are really thinking about. So there's a movement across the state line toward the Tennessee side. And I would be remiss to say it's also attractive, because if you look at our economy, we're a no income tax state. So folks that are moving here, we're one of the few states, and it's in our Constitution, that will never have a state income tax. So, but that's another story.
You're on mute.
I have lost the audio.
Sorry, that was on me. So I wanted to say that being down here in Florida, we can obviously relate to that, and relate to not having a state income tax, and having a governor that has been far more deferential to civil liberties in terms of how this lockdown was handled. And to paraphrase President Reagan, folks vote with their feet, and they will move where policies are more beneficial to them as families and individuals and business owners. And I want to refer to your governor, Governor Bill Lee, who seems to have done an excellent job there in Tennessee. How has he been deferential to the state legislature in Tennessee?
I think a number of ways. One, he's really been communicative. So he's done that with all the legislatures. We have a great relationship. I'm not alone. I have his cell phone number. I've reached out to him a number of times over the past month and a half. Additionally, he has had conference calls with every member of the General Assembly, the House and Senate, weekly when he brings in his Department of Human Services, the Health, our Unified Command, which is the structure we put in place. They've given updates so that we can take that back to our constituencies across the state, Republicans and Democrats alike. So there's been a lot of information flow, and I think that has been a real key in this whole thing, is frankly because it's like our constituents, and what all of us want is more information to deal with. So I think that flow of information back and forth has been really good. He's also taken input on what it does and how it's affecting businesses, because in the eastern part of the state where I am is much different than it is in the western part of the state. Literally realize that Memphis, Tennessee is 500 miles away from where I am. Tennessee is a very long state. And so the concerns that we have here, much different than West Tennessee.
Along those same lines, how have businesses been brought into the conversation in terms of evaluating the right decision policy making coming from the governor and the state legislature?
I think right off the bat, the governor did some very savvy things, and he's got a business background. I think that's part of why. He put in that unified command structure that I talked about. That included folks like the State Chamber of Commerce. It included small business owners, large business owners, medium business owners. And he tried really very strategically to not just deal with one industry like transportation or healthcare, but across the board. So you've got service and hospitality. You've got all the sides talking and all those perspectives coming in. I think that has been very key.
Do you attribute the ambitious phase opening plan that Tennessee has in place in part to having a business community that has bought into these policies and was involved in those discussions early on?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. We could see, because our discussions were not one way, it was both ways. I think we sent a very clear message of stability. People knew what was coming, knew the plan, knew the way forward, and I think that's been very helpful.
Turning back to, you mentioned Tennessee's lack of state income tax. So I want to turn to the economic side a bit for Tennessee. Obviously, every state's budget is going to be impacted adversely by what we've seen go on, just losing sales taxes and tourism and the wide variety of economic impact that has happened. But Tennessee, for many years, is routinely ranked among the top states for fiscal policy, fiscal solvency. 90%, over 90% of your state pension is fully funded. How do you anticipate having sound fiscal policy in place before this rainy day happened, preparing Tennessee for 2021 and 2022 and making sure that all the critical infrastructure needs and healthcare and education needs of the state of Tennessee are adequately met after this has passed?
Yeah, well, it's one of those, frankly, we haven't been planning for this, but planning for difficult times. And I'll tell you, it's right now where that planning pays off. And you talked about it. We have no income tax. We have a pension plan that is virtually fully funded. We have no road debt, AAA bond ratings from all the major investment funds. We have a rainy day fund of about $1.4 billion. So as far as being ready for this, we are. Does that mean it's going to be easy? Absolutely not, because we don't want to drain the rainy day fund, because none of us know what's going to happen in the third, fourth quarter, what's going to happen in 21. That's what we've got to do. But if you take a look, we have managed to stay with a very business-minded attitude, and our customers are our citizens. How do we deliver the best product, which is state government, to those citizens? And that product is basically what we can't do as individuals. We can't build roads. We can't have a state police force. That's things where a government does have a role, not the rest of it. So we really, really laser focused. Now, the other side is, we are going to go back into session in 3 weeks. We are heavily dependent on sales tax, and sales tax is obviously taking a severe hit. How bad will that be? That's a question we're still trying to determine. And it's not mushy, but it's very squishy right now, if you will, because we don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months. But I'll tell you, the policies and what we've done to get us to where we are have really laid it forward. And with all respect to my colleagues across the country, I would rather be here in the spot we are, not having to worry about massive road debt, massive pension funds that we have to pay. We can really focus on the business at hand.
Thanks for your comments, Senator, and we will return back to you with some more questions. But I want to turn now to Representative Aaron Miller from the 59th District in Michigan, who also represents a border district, this time bordering the state of Indiana. And again, two states that are doing things very differently. So we'd love to hear from you, Representative Miller, what you've seen from your perspective watching Indiana across the border in terms of how they've handled the response to the virus and the lockdown.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don, for having me on. Thanks to the Mackinac Center for hosting. I want to cry listening to Senator Lundberg here, and it's because that we're on the wrong side of the border here in Michigan. A lot of the same advantages that Senator Lundberg is talking about in Tennessee, we are suffering from the proportional disadvantages with the Indiana border. And while we don't have a really unique situation like Bristol, generally most of the borderland is farmland between Indiana and Michigan. We are small towns dotted across the landscape, and I sit right as we speak. I sit about 2 miles from the Indiana border, and right below the border is Howe, Indiana. And as far as commerce goes, as far as business climate goes, and as far as just about everything else goes, you can see differences when you go across the border in many ways. And as you said, Don, people vote with their feet, and they really make decisions based on what an economic climate is. And on the border here in Michigan, that really kills us. So I am in Sturgis, Michigan, and I represent a very long district, just like Senator Lundberg was talking about Tennessee. My district is several miles along the Indiana border, and people really don't pay attention to the border with their behavior as far as where they go to shop, where they go to church, who they hang out with. There's a lot of interchange across the border. Most of the people at Sturgis, Michigan's Walmart are actually from Indiana. You'll see Indiana plates, and you'll see a lot of Amish at the Walmart here in town hitched up. So people go across the border all the time, but they really do make decisions on where they live, where they work, based on those economic climates that each state puts together. And some of it is not necessarily thought about. Some of it may not be a conscious decision, but if there are more jobs, if there's more work available in a state like Indiana, people, human beings, will just naturally fill that vacuum and they'll go toward those jobs. And so, Don, I could really write you the book on your question there, your lead-in. But yeah, I am on the wrong side of the border in this case, as it pertains to both of our states in normal times and both of our states in coronavirus crisis times. And so I can kind of give you the other side of the picture here.
You mentioned commerce. Obviously, we mentioned it earlier, the national economy has been greatly affected, but obviously states are being adversely affected based on how the governor of each respective state is handling the situation. In your opinion, what industries are going to be hurt the most in both the short and long term as a result of some of the governor's policies and just naturally speaking in response to a virus that has obviously scared a lot of people and has shrunk the size of the economy?
Yeah, good question. I would say in general, without getting into too much detail, I think in general it's safer to assume that the smaller the business, with these big waves in this storm that we're experiencing, the best picture I can put together is the smaller your boat, the more the big waves are going to affect you. So really the small businesses with less cash on hand, with less ability to shoulder this storm, they are going to be the ones that are greatly affected, more greatly than larger corporations. Of course, Ford and GM are going to be hit by this, but they have the means to be able to shoulder this, whereas smaller businesses, your downtown shops and your restaurants, most of those are 1 and 2 and 3 person businesses. Of course, restaurants are going to have a number of employees serving, cooking, bussing tables, but those small businesses are the ones I've heard from the most, who just at this point can't make it. But there are some others that come to mind as well, because timelines are important to their business. And around here, because Michigan gets pretty severe winters, that's obvious to most people on this call. Our restaurants are one entity that sees quite a huge influx of people, especially from Chicago in this area, quite an influx in the summer. And then in the winter, it may still be going, but it's just a lot less, and they may not be making money, and summer's just their money maker. So the more we delve into summer, the more we delve into those timelines. Another industry that comes to mind has been greenhouses, and greenhouses were let go and free to open in Indiana. And we delved into greenhouse season in Michigan, and yet they were still closed, still forbidden from selling certain products. And for those greenhouses, their crucial point is just a few weeks or a couple months in the year, and then they drop off, or then they pivot to something else. But timelines are really important, and so especially those businesses for whom spring was the time, they're going to be the most greatly affected.
I'd say, yep, it's going to be very challenging times ahead for businesses all across this country and of course, in the state of Michigan. Want to turn now to the lawsuit that the legislature recently filed against the governor. Mackinac Center has also filed a lawsuit against the governor, representing 3 medical practices and their ability to reach people in need. You can find out more information on that on our website, mackinaw.org. But please walk us through the lawsuit that the legislature filed against the governor.
Sure, there are many moving parts. And first, I'll remind anybody listening that every single state has a different constitution and different laws. So when one state earns a victory or a defeat, it is apples and oranges across the nation. It's not the same type of lawsuit. A lot of people have seen, Don, where Wisconsin's Supreme Court overturned Governor Evers' orders over there. And a lot of Michigan people have said, well, why can't the same happen here? And the important thing is to remember that we have different laws. So Michigan has several different laws governing executive orders in times of emergency. And the downside to many different laws is it's fairly confusing which law you follow. Really, you have to follow all of them. There's no law that supersedes another. There are just some laws that specify what an emergency can be declared about, and those laws put different limits on the governor's executive power in those states of emergency. And in one of our laws cases, that limit was 28 days. After 28 days, the legislature had to essentially extend or renew permission to continue that state of emergency. And that's what the governor was declaring under at first. That was a 1976 law. And the legislature on April 7th did extend the state of emergency to April 30th. We did rubber stamp that permission. And come April 30th, there had just not been a communication. There had not been any working together. And so on April 30th, the legislature, under the 1976 law, decided to say no. We have not been listened to. We've not been heard. We are going to exercise our authority and say no to the extension of the state of emergency. And there is another law, as I mentioned, there's a 1945 law that does not have any sort of time limit written into it. It was written in post-World War II or right at the end of World War II. That was the context. And there was no limit put on the executive power. Well, of course, times change and crises change. And so really you have this blank slate, really broad power law from 1945 that now Governor Whitmer is using. And the legislature essentially is saying to the Court of Claims and probably in the future to the Michigan Supreme Court, this law is unconstitutional based on the fact that it upsets the natural balance of power between, in this case, 2 branches of government, the legislative branch and the governor's branch. And as far as I understand, there should be a ruling coming from the Court of Claims today or tomorrow. And then win or lose, it will probably be appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court post haste right after that. And then we'll see when that ruling comes. But that's about as brief an update on that court case as I can give.
Very helpful. And I should add that the Mackinac Center has filed a brief in support of that lawsuit against the governor. And we're anxiously awaiting that decision and that a proper representative government is restored there in the state of Michigan. Turning back to the governor, do you criticize Governor Whitmer more for her public policy decisions or for a perceived lack of leadership, of not doing what Governor Lee has done in Tennessee and engaging the state legislature, engaging the business community, and acting in a much more autocratic way? What would you say is something that is deserving of greater criticism?
Where do I start? I think it's really both, Don. I think they mesh together. I think they have everything to do with each other. So it's tough to delineate which of her decisions falls in which box. But really, you could describe her actions with both pieces of your question. There has been little communication as far as a plan for reopening. In fact, search Michigan's plan for reopening, you can't find it. We don't really have a plan. We have a loose set of stages, but the thing is, when Governor Whitmer came out with those stages a couple of weeks ago and said we are at stage 3, really, I think the majority of the populace of Michigan said, not only have we flattened the curve, we are on a severe downward trend in our numbers. Thank the Lord. That's a great thing, but most people can see the data for themselves. And really, if you looked at our stages, we were in stage 4. You could make a clear case for it. So that's just the stages of kind of where we're at, but there's no plan connected with those stages. And so what you saw a couple days ago was announced that Northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, which is a great deal of the land of our state, not a great deal of population, they are going to be able to open up. And what I've heard from a lot of those colleagues up there is that they were completely blindsided by that. There was no heads up that this was coming. I think that they're thankful for it, but there was no plan. And it was just, it came and hit us, and we found out, we had to look in the news what regions were opening and how they were opening. And to contrast it, I've looked quite a bit at Indiana's plans because we deal with them right across the border. And their plan is open. It is very descriptive. It is descriptive to both all the taxpayers, all the individuals in the state of Indiana living there, but it's also descriptive to the businesses that have to live under that climate. And it really gives them a heads up as far as what's going to be happening when, that way they can plan. So there's been a lack of openness. There's been a lack of planning. And notable in the governor's press conferences, most every day she gives them, is that she just says she's making decisions based on science and data. But the question I would ask, and the question that thousands of people frankly have asked, is tell us the science and data you are using so that we can look at those decisions. But it's been much more closed off now.
Yeah, it has certainly seemed that way. Seems as though it's been very reactionary and less having to do with a long thought out plan, as we've seen in other states like Tennessee, Indiana, Florida, Georgia. As much as I loathe this phrase, in the spirit of bipartisanship, is there a good policy action that you've seen done by the governor during this time?
One thing early on was the removing of liability. She is basically governing the entire state by executive order, and so everything that is affected by the coronavirus crisis, the legislature is basically put off to the side in a waiting room. That's kind of a picture of where we're at. And one thing the governor did was remove a lot of liability for health care for first responders. And those are good things. It's important to realize that those are good executive orders and should be made, ought to be made, whether they are law or made by executive order. But the fact is, when you have one person calling the shots, you're going to have some shots that are good, and you're going to have some that are bad, inevitably, just because there's one person doing it. And that's essentially the crux of the lawsuit. But there are many executive orders, I should stress, that are necessary and good. The governor came out with her education plan at the beginning of April, basically telling schools what can be expected of them. There was a lot of local control, and basically schools were told, come up with your own plan. It can be how you decide, and you're going to educate your students. We're going to hold you to your plan, but you have to come up with your own plan. So there were many good executive orders. The liability piece and the education pieces are some of those that I can.
Are they, along those lines, are there any regulations that have been cast aside during this response that you would like to see stay in place? In other words, keep deregulated, that you think would be beneficial to folks in Michigan?
As far as regulations that have cast aside that I want to keep, as a former elections chair, one of the things I worry about is elections, and I worry about the integrity of our ballot places and how those ballots are cast. And I do not like how the how the behavior as far as how we run elections has gone. It's gone toward pushing automatic absentee voter, sending ballot applications out to, this was just announced a couple days ago, that the Secretary of State is going to send absentee voter applications out to every single registered voter in the state of Michigan. And I like that voting has always generally been an organic process on the onus, or with the onus on the individual. And I think that's what it should be, what it ought to be forever. But we're moving away from that. So it's one thing that I get really leery about. There are licensing regulations that we have sort of cast aside in this crisis in the name of public health and safety, which is usually what the argument is for the licensing requirements. And so there are some licensing requirements that have gone away that I say, do we really need them back? And I think that ought to be a legitimate discussion when we have the time to say, hold on, in a public crisis, we got rid of some of these licensing regulations. That's one thing about Indiana. They have much less regulation, a much shorter code. It's easier to follow, therefore. And I say, and many others say, should we take a look at getting rid of some of those? Yes.
Yeah. One of the licenses that has been in the news quite a lot has involved haircutting, and we know that's been very prevalent in the state of Michigan. Now, I should ask, have you been able to sneak across the border into Indiana to find a good barber?
Luckily, my mother and my wife have cut my hair all my life, and so I'm a cheater. I've still gotten my hair cut, but I don't get my hair cut at a licensed barber. So maybe that's an argument against the licensing of barbers. My mother and my wife have never taken a class for it, and they do pretty well, I'd say. So I have not had to, but Don, I can definitely say I've got plenty of constituents who, if you see them on a Zoom call or you see them at the store or whatever, they're looking pretty shaggy and they need to go across the border and to get a haircut, and they certainly do. That's one thing I want to say is at this point, just to observe reality out there. One, if you go into Sturgis, our downtown is teeming with cars most every day. Businesses may not be operating where they can't, but people, human beings, are still they're traveling all over the place, and they're disregarding some of the orders at this point. As far as going into the other areas where there are haircuts, there are restaurants, people are doing that all over the place. My Facebook is one big stream of watching people either go out to eat in Indiana, go shop in Indiana, or go get their nails or their hair done in Indiana.
We appreciate your transparency with regards to your unlicensed haircuts for going on the record here and talking about that. I want to open up this next question to both you and Senator Lundberg. And Representative Miller, we'll start with you first to answer this question, then turn to you, okay. Senator Lundberg. One of the words that have been used quite often during this crisis, if you want to call it that, is the words essential and non-essential. Classifying certain businesses and certain occupations as essential and non-essential. Representative Miller, do you have any concerns about that type of language being used to categorize individuals and business owners who obviously use those businesses to put food on their table for their families, to put food on the table of the people that work for them, pay their rents, their mortgages? What are your comments on that?
Yeah, I disagree strongly with a characterization of using essential versus non-essential because, one, it classes people, it classifies people, and it puts them into silos. And it really makes you think, wait a second, this is non-essential? But really, that's not the case. What people have found out in this crisis, and thank goodness they found it, is that all of our commerce, all of our economy is essential when it comes down to it. It may not seem essential on its face, but we are obviously all part of a web of services, of goods, travel, of commerce that is one of the most amazing webs in the world. We should be proud of that. And I think from the beginning, the error has been calling it essential versus non-essential. I credit Senator Majority Leader Mike Shirkey, whose district borders mine, he was instrumental in pushing for calling it safe versus unsafe. Let's talk about safe versus unsafe. And I think that's the most important conversation, because really everything that is part of that web, every part of our economy is essential. Someone's livelihood, even if it is a small downtown shop, still could probably be done safely, and it still is essential. Is it essential to sustain life? I say yes, but they've been shut down, a lot of those one-man shops, because they've been classified as non-essential. And if you look at every one of Michigan's orders, I think this is a mistake, but every one of Michigan's orders says basically stop everything that doesn't sustain life. And again, I would point back to the fact that this crisis has taught us that everything sustains life, that everything in that web sustains somebody's life. And then look at the government. Tax revenue doesn't come from the magic money tree. Tax revenue comes from economic activity and business people making jobs and employing people, small business people creating their own shop. That's where it all comes from, and that's the mistake, is forgetting that. But I think this crisis has reminded us of that.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, and a lot of economic, as you say, economic activity is connected, as we've seen with the challenges to our supply chain on getting food out to people. All of these decisions in terms of deeming who's essential and non-essential has a trickle-down effect on other businesses that deliver to us or get to us things that were deemed essential during this crisis. So now I want to turn to Senator Lundberg on that question regarding essentiality versus non-essentiality and the use of that language.
I think Representative Miller said it very well. How do you differentiate essential versus non-essential? And I don't know, because the other clause in there, it's interesting that if you're deemed non-essential, you are essential if you supply an essential worker, or an essential business. So I don't know of any business, because every business I know of, we're all interconnected. I don't think there is a non-essential business and deemed by a governmental entity. And again, it's one, whether it's the delivery of products, the delivery of foods, the delivery of services, all of those are essential. I would argue even the barber who cuts your hair, and you're an essential worker. Therefore, that barber is an essential business, and personal grooming. And I think Representative Miller, again, hit it very well, talking about, let's talk about who's safe and who's not safe. And if someone's not safe, how do we get them into a position where they are safe for interaction?
Yeah. Next question is going to be for both of you again. We'll start with Senator Lundberg. You both represent areas that have a bit more rural area than urban centers. And one thing we've seen across the country is a bit of dissension that has risen up amidst residents who live in more rural areas versus those who are in more densely populated areas. Is that something you've seen amongst your constituents?
It is, and
Senator Lundberg?
if you look, let's talk politically now about Tennessee.
Sure.
Republicans have supermajorities in the House and Senate, and obviously we have the governor's house. If you look where the concentration of the more liberal policies are coming from, it's from our two population centers, Nashville and Memphis areas. And frankly, if you look at the majority of the state, where are the issues, where are the concerns? Nashville makes national news right now, not just about COVID and as a hotspot, but take a look at the fiscal issues that Nashville itself is having. And it has had huge problems over the past few years because of very liberal spending and social programs that they're trying to bring into that area. Same kind of thing that has happened in Shelby County, where Memphis is. And if you look at the education systems, and we're trying to help strengthen those areas. So there is a real dichotomy that way of what happens in, frankly, the rest of the state and Nashville and Memphis in many ways.
Representative Miller, your comments on that?
So my internet went out for just a little bit. Don, go ahead and repeat the question for me. I heard you talk about rural
Sure.
areas.
Yeah. We were talking about the differentiation between those that are residing in rural areas, like your district is more closely aligned to, than those with more densely populated urban centers, and any dissension that you've possibly seen amongst constituents that live in those rural areas versus those living in those more densely populated urban areas.
A really good question. So we've been up in the Upper Peninsula early on in the coronavirus crisis, and the Upper Peninsula is uniquely positioned for shouldering this crisis because people are already naturally separated. You've got to drive an hour to get to the next big town, maybe more in some cases. And so much of rural Michigan is well positioned, and probably that's why our numbers are lower. A colleague that sits behind me in the Michigan House, and so we talk quite often. She represents 5 counties, Representative Dare Rendon, and she's up in central northern Michigan. And I asked her how many of her counties were in the new region that was basically opened up. And she said 4 out of her 5 counties. And I asked which is the 5th county. She said Ogemaw County. It's a very small county, very rural. And I said, wait a second, Ogemaw has very few cases, 0 deaths, 12 cases actually, and hardly any people there in the first place, no offense to Ogemaw, but a very low population. I said, why was Ogemaw County not included in that region? It makes perfect sense. And she said, well, they were regionalized with Saginaw, and Saginaw, if anybody knows on the call, is a completely different world from Ogemaw County. And that's the mistake of lumping in large regions with each other, in my opinion. And that's what we're seeing in Michigan. So rural Michigan is doing very well. You look at our numbers, especially northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, they're doing extremely well and good for them. But they should be allowed to open up more because of it. And that's what we're only starting to see a couple days ago. And who knows what's going to happen next? Nobody knows.
Yeah. Next question is, again, going to be for both Representative Miller and Senator Lundberg. We'll start with you, Representative. A little bit more lighthearted in nature, but what activities are you most looking forward to reopening and enjoying this summer as the restrictions start to hopefully fade away?
Well, I could tell you we went out to eat the other day, since it's a pretty close drive, and I will tell you, going out to eat never felt so good. I didn't think I'd ever look forward to it so much. For the most part, for me, just looking at my own schedule, getting back to a normal schedule and getting out of working from home is something I'm looking forward to. I have 3 young girls who are 4, 3, and 1, and working from home is just not. It's difficult with 3 young girls. So I'm looking forward to getting back to a regular schedule. I think a lot of other people are in the same boat. Frankly, I'm looking forward to some of the summer activities that we're able to enjoy in Michigan that are either stifled or closed right now. One that comes to mind is campgrounds, and that's been a hot discussion this last week because we are really approaching camping season, whether it's a private campground or it's summer camps for kids. And private campground, that's recreational, and that's still important, but summer camp is something that is extremely important for kids, especially kids who don't get to experience things like that normally. And so that's something that I'm looking forward to, both for our kids, but for other kids too.
That's great, yeah. And I hope you'll be able to enjoy that with your family. And I want to ask that same question of Senator Lundberg. Obviously, Tennessee is a little bit more of an advanced phase in terms of reopening, but what are you most looking forward to in terms of activities that were deemed non-essential during this crisis?
Well, one we've got coming up in just a couple of weeks. You mentioned, Don, at the start that Bristol is home to Bristol Motor Speedway. And
Sure.
Go back to a town of 50,000. We have a speedway that holds 156,000 people. And for NASCAR fans, it's a mecca. It's a great venue. At the end of this month, just about a week and a couple of days away, you'll have the Food City 500 at Bristol Motor Speedway. It will be empty. That's very disappointing because, frankly, I want to go, and I know there are thousands of Michiganders that want to go and folks from Ohio. And you're right, we have more latitude because most of our places are open right now. So we can go to, here's my sales pitch, by the way, for come to Gatlinburg and Dollywood, come visit. We'd love to have you. And despite what I said about Nashville's politics, it's a great town to visit and enjoy the music there, or Memphis, and come to Bristol. I also miss, frankly, going on the other side because, I shop sometimes on the Bristol, Virginia side of town. I like the restaurants and the people over there. I'd like to go inside and sit down and support some of them.
Yeah, that's great. And along those lines, you mentioned live sports starting to return, obviously without fans. How important do you think, we saw back during the time of World War II, how important baseball was for the spirit of the American people? How important, and going back to 9/11, I'm originally from New York City, and I lived through 9/11 in New York, and I remember how important the Yankees and the Mets were to New York City during that time. How important do you think the return of live sports will be to the morale of people in Tennessee and around the country?
Yeah, for us, it's a natural because like Bristol Motor Speedway, synonymous literally in the names of our town is part of that. But I think it is much bigger than that. It is that competition that I think we need on a national basis. It's one of those, we want to root for somebody. We want to see that. We want to feel that. And that's what you get from sports. That's what it's about. You also want the sportsmanship, and we want to root for somebody. That's what we as Americans want to do. It's part of our DNA. I truly believe so. I think bringing sports back online is very, very important.
Yeah, great. Senator, we are going to return to you before the end of the program. I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience. We have a few questions for Representative Miller, but I will have one more question for you, Senator. I want to start with questions from Rich Weber, who has submitted some great questions. We had some questions from Gregory, but Representative Miller has already answered those. So for Representative Miller, what would be your response be to folks who are frankly have been scared by the constant media harping on the virus and the possible outcomes of the virus? How do we overcome that hysteria and that feeling of fright about going back out into the real world and leaving our homes?
I think the most important antidote to fear is hope. And that's something that I think every leader, Republican or Democrat, here or there, needs to offer hope. And the hope is currently that the numbers are going down. That's wonderful. Everybody can agree with that. And fortunately, many people are in a very good spot to be able to shoulder the virus. I would still say, not from a fear standpoint, but for those who are dealing with other conditions that might complicate catching coronavirus, I'd say please, for your own health, protect yourself, not out of fear, but out of love for you and your family members. Stay home and avoid catching the virus. But there is hope for the world. Senator talked about it and referenced what we appreciate as Americans, what lifts our morale. And for me, that would have been watching the Masters golf tournament this spring and seeing Augusta lit up by the sunshine. And we weren't able to experience that. And so there are some intangibles, but for the most part, I would offer hope and the fact that we will one day come out of this crisis. Hopefully we come out having learned some things, and hopefully we come out better for the wear. But the biggest thing I would offer in the face of fear is hope that things are getting better and things can get back to normal.
That's great. You spoke about working from home with young children. If any of you may have heard in the background there, my 4-year-old just set off our house alarm. So if you heard that in the background, my apologies. But one of the perils of working from home with young kids. I want to turn back to you, Representative Miller. Another question from Rich Weber. Will the legislature pass legislation that clarifies and limits those emergency powers currently in place in Michigan?
Yeah, very, very timely question. My good friend, Senator Tom Barrett, who I served with in the House, and actually I attended college with, Senator Tom Barrett introduced a bill to repeal the 1945 Act, and the reason for the repeal rather than changing it is because we have other laws that govern states of emergency enough to the point where the 1976 law is just fine. It contains some good limits already. Why not just go with that law? And so he introduced a bill repealing that law, and I'm sure we're going to see several other bills introduced to either change it, but his, I believe, was a straight repeal, and I would support that, but those are already in the works for sure.
Great news. Question from one more on Michigan. Question from Barb. Traverse City will partially open restaurants this Friday, but hotels and motels are remaining closed, but their bars and restaurants remain open. This makes no sense in light of the low virus impact to the area. Any ideas on the schizophrenic nature of opening hotels and motels that have bars and restaurants, but not allowing people to stay in said hotels and motels?
So hotels, I believe, are still open. Those are probably Northern Michigan seasonal hotels that may not have opened yet, just because of cash flow or because of not enough customers. So it could be a number of things. But yeah, essentially you touched on the issue of what I was talking about earlier, though, of the web that is our economy. And when you interrupt certain parts of that web, you get sort of that schizophrenic nature where one part of the economy, in this case hotels, is not able to service the same people that would go to the open bars and restaurants. So at this point, I believe I'd have to go back and look at the governor's orders. I think hotels are operating, but some of them may not be operating again because the customer base is very low and they might not be able to financially operate. But that touches on an important issue where you might not get as many people coming to the restaurants and bars if they don't have anywhere to stay in Traverse City and they're not from there.
I actually want to open this, a question from George Nastas. It's a really good question, and I want to open it up to both you and Senator Lundberg quickly. It is a complicated question, but the best you can answer. Creative destruction is changing the private sector. We're seeing it in a lot of different aspects of the economy, a lot of different industries. How could the Michigan government be subjected to creative destruction and capital, and so that taxes can be best allocated to the best uses or returned to taxpayers through privatization or downsizing of state government programs, universities, and public schools? So I'll open that one up to, it's a little bit complex, but I'll open that one up to both of you, starting with you, Representative Miller. Applying creative destruction to how government does business and governing in a more effective manner that defers more to private industry.
Really good question. I've not heard it put in light of that phrase, really, in that term. But we are about to enter the creative destruction period, whether we like it or not. We are going to see record budget cuts, not because somebody's choosing to do that, but because of necessity, because our income coming into the state has not been near to where it was predicted to be. And again, if I didn't say it clearly enough, Michigan's restrictions have been the highest. Michigan's unemployment, therefore, has been the highest among all 50 states. And so you could expect that our budget hit is going to be either the highest or one of the highest at least. And so here we are dealing with that. So if there are colleges, any organizations that depend on government revenue at this point, not downsizing and not cutting anywhere they can, they're making a big mistake, because that large budget cut is coming down the pike. And we're going to have to do some creative destruction out of necessity. My appropriations chairman, under whom I serve as vice chair on our appropriations committee in the House, made a really good point the other day in a hearing. Several state employees were saying how they believe their work ethic, their efficiency is better working from home. And he smiled and he said, "I suppose we can take away your state buildings in which are your offices." And I think they were then starting to walk back some of those comments. But maybe we're going to change some of the things. Maybe it's not getting rid of office buildings, but maybe we're going to change some of the way we do things because we have to. That's definitely coming up. That's part two of the crisis, is we're going to see the budget crisis that plays out. Governor Whitmer's strategy for that has simply been going to the federal government to ask for revenue.
Yeah. And I want to say a great answer to that question, and a great question from George. Senator Lundberg, as we close things up, any comments on that question about how Tennessee will solve, will handle their budget issues or any budget issues they may face as a result of the creative destruction brought about by this virus?
Similar answer. I think it's easier in Tennessee. If you look at us philosophically, we believe in smaller government. Before I was a senator, I was a state house member, served 5 terms, so I've been in office 14 years. 14 years ago, there were more state employees. We had more office space. We have less, and we're going to have less in a year from now. So philosophically, frankly, for all of us, and I say all of us in Tennessee and legislatively, that's the page we're on, to trim and trim and trim. And it's the same kind of philosophy we use in business. How do we become more efficient at delivering the products and services to our customers, our citizens?
Well, I want to, we have run out of time for our audience questions. Any questions that aren't asked and then answered, we will best try to answer via email. But I did have one more question, and this came from a colleague of mine, our Vice President of Strategic Outreach, Lindsay Killen, who thinks very highly of you down there in Bristol, Tennessee, and she's wondering if you'd reconsider moving back to your native Michigan to serve the good folks of Michigan.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and with all respect and love and admiration of the folks in Michigan, very happy here. So very happy.
Understandably so, and I feel the same way down here in Florida. I must add, for all my colleagues, I regret that I don't get to see them as often as I'd like, but it is nice living under Governor DeSantis down here in Florida, who's done a great job. I want to thank Senator Lundberg, Representative Miller, for a great hour discussion. We could have gone on for, I think, a much longer time, and perhaps there'll be a part 2 to this as we go further down the line and try to come out of this. But I want to thank you for your time and your service to your local communities and to your respective states, and for all you're doing and for interacting with our supporters here at the Mackinac Center. I want to remind our audience that our next event will be May 27th. That's a week from today, on environmental policy and energy. Really excited about that. I'm sure that will be another well-attended event. As always, you can find a recording of this event via our YouTube channel, or you can simply go to our website, mackinaw.org, and look for future events there at mackinaw.org/events. We thank you for continuing to join us here for our virtual events. This has been, I think, a wonderful event and been really helpful to a lot of folks, and we hope you'll share it with friends and family that are interested in this subject matter. And we wish you all a safe and enjoyable, as best you can, Memorial Day weekend. And take care. We will talk soon.